A very warm welcome on behalf of Siemens to this session on making cities more livable, more sustainable in the future. The session will be split into three parts. We have three panels, one on how to produce food and consume food in the future, the second panel on staying safe in our future cities, and the third panel on technology. Is it really driving the future of smart cities? So again, a very warm welcome, and I'd want to point out to you, the audience, that you are invited to join in these sessions by submitting your question on the right-hand side. And I want to start actually by asking the audience the first question in a little poll, just to get us warmed up and started into the discussion. And that question is, how much of the food that you buy and consume from your supermarkets actually comes from your countries? Is it produced there? Now, is that 0%? Is it under 25%? Under 50%? Or more than 50%? If you can please make your selection now. And as we're waiting for that answer to come through, I would like to take a moment to introduce our panelists for this session on the future of producing food and consuming food. And let me take a moment. It's Dilys Boey, Assistant CEO at Enterprise Singapore, joining us from Singapore. Dr. Michael Voigtmann, CTO, Singapore Aquaculture Technologies, also in Singapore. And Rainer Brehm, CEO, Factory Automation in Germany at Siemens. So welcome. I'm Amanda Kayne, I'm your moderator. I work at Pictet Wealth Management. So, do we have an answer for that poll yet, please? I think we do. So, 9% has said 0% of the food that they buy at their local supermarkets does not come from their countries. Oh, no, I apologize. No, that is 0% actually comes from their countries, so that's 9% of you. 63%, that's the largest chunk, has said under 25% is produced in their home country, 14% under 50%, and 13%, sorry, and another 13% over 50%. And just 1% has said 100%. That's good going. That's very good going. Okay, well, that takes us into the start of our session. And we have a similar question for our panelists. Now, depending on where you're located, of course, I don't know if your last meal was lunch or breakfast, but can you tell me how much of that you consumed over your last meal was actually produced locally? Michael, I'll ask you the first question.
Thanks very much, Amanda. Well, I had a salad, and Singapore does grow leafy greens, so that may have come from Singapore. I know for sure that the egg that came with the salad was Singaporean, but I'm not so sure about the bread. I think it may have had some Japanese starter yeast in there.
Okay, interesting. Very international salad that you had there, Michael. How about you, Dilys?
Well, out in Singapore, food's very important. So breakfast, lunch, and dinner is most important meals for us. So for me, it would be the quintessential chicken rice, and seeing how 90% of our food on our plates come from overseas, I will hesitate to guess that my chicken either came from Malaysia or Brazil, and the rice either from Vietnam or India.
Thank you very much, Dilys. And Rainer, how about you in Germany there?
Well, it would have been breakfast, but as I did leave very early at 5:30 in the morning to come to the studio here. So I only had a coffee. But I can guarantee you the coffee didn't come from Germany. Probably was out of Ethiopia or out of Brazil. So no breakfast this morning. Normally I would have cereals where the oat probably is not from, I don't know where the oat comes from, but I have it with fruits, and normally the fruits are coming from local production.
And were you surprised by the answer to our poll? So especially the 1% that can confirm that 100% of what they buy locally is actually produced locally. Were you surprised by any of those numbers, Michael?
I was surprised. I'd love to live in a country where everything comes locally, but that seems not to be the nature of the food industry these days. I think the real issue is we don't know where our food exactly comes from. And I guess that's why we all give different answers and we struggle. So that spread in your poll doesn't surprise me at all.
Thank you, Michael.
I would maybe just to step in. I think kind of I was grown up at a farm, and that was completely normal that everything basically you have eaten basically came from there. And it might not apply too much to cities, but at least for urban or kind of rural areas, probably a lot of people maybe didn't checking that 100% maybe of their own garden in front of their house.
Amanda, perhaps it tells me how international this audience is today, because the answers really range from the lower end of the spectrum to the other end.
Absolutely, and what we can learn from one another. That's the point of having such a discussion. But Michael, you raised a very good point about transparency and how we track and where we actually know where the food we consume comes from. But that will come up a little bit later in our discussion. Let's start off by just discussing traditional farming, which perhaps, Rainer, we'll start with you as you grew up on a farm. It's your background. It does take a lot of manual labor, a lot of space to farm. And how are we actually seeing changes in this traditional farming to make it more smart?
Yeah, absolutely, Amanda. I mean, I grew up on a farm, worked a lot on a farm, and I know how hard and time-consuming the manual labor is, number one. And number two, then how disappointing it is if the weather conditions doesn't play right, too little rain or even a flood, or maybe a storm, and then the harvest basically is destroyed. And so I was always thinking, okay, maybe how we can improve that. Our farm was too small to really get scaled, because nowadays making farming profitable, you need to have bigger sizes. But I think more and more, I would say automation comes into it to make it smart. Is it the automation on an irrigation system? How much fertilizer you're gonna use? You're gonna use maybe data to identify that and don't give too much fertilizer. And with that, I think you're solving a problem, and you get more and more transparent and more automated. And I like that, because nowadays I'm working in the automation area, a lot of automation in the food and beverage area, but also in other areas. And one example, really trying to get more productivity out of it with less use of resources, more sustainable. That's in the middle of industry. So I'm very excited that more and more of those technologies are also going to be applied in the future in the food production. And also limited space is in industry also a given thing. Normally those factories are not so big, so we produce cars maybe over 3 storages. And if you compare that now to farming, we have a big trend on vertical controlled environment, vertical farming. So you also go to several layers. And if you do vertical farming, then you can also, again, go closer to the cities or even do it within a city.
Thank you. And Michael, in Singapore, what are you seeing there in terms of automation? Is that what's really driving farming to make it less reliant on weather, less reliant on perhaps labor, and also not so heavy when it comes to resources?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Rainer brought up the issue of the weather, and most of us are aware that we're in changing times, and the weather is no longer as predictable as it may once have been. So we are really seeing a shift towards what we call climate resilient farming, where we can deal or mitigate the changes. In my instance, it might be a change in the water or the water temperature and the organisms that live in the water. And if you're doing vertical farming for vegetables, then you're changing, for instance, the correct wavelength that you need to grow in terms of photosynthesis. In Europe, it's about mitigating for hailstorms or for heavy rain, et cetera, et cetera. So this mitigation and decoupling from normal weather is very important. But Singapore has additional constraints, and one of those is, of course, space, which Rainer also mentioned. We either need to go vertical, or we need to go out onto other spaces which are so far not being used, like the sea. And that's exactly what we do with our smart farming on the sea or digital farming on the sea. We use the space rather than just the content of the water.
And Michael, actually, just to interrupt you there, we've had a question come in. How do we coordinate food production in an urban environment? As you rightly said, you're at the sea, perhaps the city is not on the sea, perhaps it's inland. How do we coordinate all of this and bring it together?
Super complex. And of course, data plays a big role in that. The data of logistics, the data of just-in-time deliveries. But I will say one thing, the closer you are to your market, or if you're at the point of consumption, of course, the much easier that becomes in terms of planning, in terms of mitigating spoilage due to long transport distances. So that coordination becomes a lot easier when you talk about urban farming. And I think that's really the point, or one of the points we want to discuss today. How possible is it to farm locally? And how is that different to traditional farming? I mean, we heard about manpower, we heard about climate, and there's also data and big data.
Dilys, Michael rightly pointed out that the goal could be to produce everything locally. How likely do you believe that is? I mean, we just heard that the coffee bean probably doesn't come from the local area. The grains from the cereal probably don't either. Is it possible to really, grow everything we need and consume it locally?
Well, I think, Amanda, we've got to recognize the limitations, perhaps of, the cities that we live in, and particularly in Singapore. We're living on an island, 700 square kilometers of land, and much of it is urbanized. So I think in the past 50 years since independence, we really had to give up a lot of that land for urban development and shift into food production. But with the advent of high-tech agriculture and aquaculture, it really opens up opportunities for a small city-state like Singapore to really produce a lot more locally. I don't think it will probably be a far stretch to get to 50-80% of local produce, but we're starting small, right? So in 2019, the government through the Singapore Food Agency launched what we're calling the 30 by 30 plan, which is getting to 30% of local nutrition produce by 2030. So we're really starting with that goal, and that in itself entails a lot of high-tech investments in either vertical farming or automated farming. But I also want to add that in developing such high-tech farms, we do need to consider really the different set of skills that we need to build within the agriculture industry. For example, high-tech engineering capability, whether it's process engineering, mechanical, electrical engineering, even software engineering, right? When we're talking about IoT or using big data to make decisions, but also coupled with, food science and nutrition experts. So I think that really opens up the industry to a whole new world, whole new capability that traditional manual farms never had access to.
Dilys and Michael, in Singapore, I'll take Singapore as the example because it is very dense in terms of urbanization and buildings. Have there been any success stories when it comes to the vertical farming? I just had a question in, has it been commercially viable?
Dilys, maybe you want to jump in there first.
I was hoping you would, but I can go. As I said, the development to high-tech agriculture is pretty much at the nascent stages, but we have seen some early successes. For example, I can name Sustainia, a local indoor farm that's looking at building controlled environments. Where much of the production is automated and it's largely indoor, right? So we're not at the mercy of the climate or the local weather conditions. It does take a lot of capex investments. They are quite confident on an operating capacity basis that the OPEX costs would be quite well contained. In fact, they project that they probably use about 95% less water than traditional farming methods. and energy consumption is also kind of lower than industry standards. In terms of the initial pricing to market, I think we have seen some of our local players being quite competitive, but I think there are areas in which the industry needs to look at possibilities of bringing down the unit costs of production. So for some of the smaller farms, they probably don't have the scale to invest in facilities across the entire value chain. So for example, whether it's automated harvesting technology or automated packaging, even investing in logistics and facilities, whether there is sufficient economies of scale for each enterprise to do so. And perhaps the question is then, as an industry, are there opportunities to perhaps build partnerships? We have seen models overseas where they run through cooperators, for example, where some of these facilities can be shared. And perhaps that could be a means of bringing down the unit cost of production. But, I'll be keen to hear from the industry's view as well, whether there will be recommendations or suggestions, how best can, local farms work as an ecosystem.
I think that's a very good point you make, Dilys, actually, bringing up the investment question. And also, how do you encourage farmers, local farmers, to be excited by automation and high tech when it costs so much? Michael, do you have an answer?
Yeah, look, I mean, really good points. So high tech is more than just automation, whether it's harvesting or whether it's planting, if you're coming from the leafy vegetable segment. High tech is about precision farming and carefully using the resources that you need and being sure that we're not wasting resources. And a good example is, of course, the fish farming industry where we are currently operating in. Half the costs of production of a fish is, of course, fish food. It's not labor and it's not energy or electricity or data. So precision farming lets you prevent overfeeding. And if you have overfeeding under control, then you start seeing a direct flow back to your bottom line. And it's not as though it's simply technology for the sake of it. Once you control feed, you control oxygen, you control water, you control all of those parameters that give rise to a better crop, a healthier fish, less disease. Then, of course, you start removing other cost factors like medicines that you might need to counter an outbreak. You might see that your growth yields have increased. And then you start thinking to yourself, well, why has that happened? And the question or the answer to that is data. And so now we see high-tech farming moving into data farming, where we want to compare data from other farms producing similar units, but maybe under different conditions. And as we heard just now, we require completely different people to manage those sorts of complex problems. These are also engineers, they're data scientists, of course, they're veterinarian people, they're people who understand husbandry. So the whole industry is now looking for a new talent that we didn't have before.
Thank you, Michael. Raina, we've had a question come in from Sri Lanka, and that question is on smarter food production and incorporating food security and safety. And maybe I can also sort of use that question in conjunction with a question of my own, which was to do with genetically modified farming and how this plays a role in the future of smart food production. Rainer, if you'd like to take that question.
Sure, a very good question, and it comes a little bit to the what Michael just said on this precision farming. So the question is, how can we reduce resources, and whether it's gene manipulated topics, we basically go into the food itself. This works on both sides. Maybe we get even a further optimization, but the real question is, how can we optimize even kind of traditional growing vegetables or food? And that is very important, that we really go in there and discuss where are the cost drivers. And as Michael said, as fish farming, for example, maybe it's the food. In other aspects, it's maybe the manual work, the cost driver, or the cost of the land. So identify those cost driver and then really optimizing out of that. And one good example is Also on the vertical farming, there was a question, are there references? Yeah, there are references. And for example, we have a center of competence in the Netherlands where we do that vertical farming, and we scale it now up. Because as Michael also said, and this is to GMO as well, how you scale it up. Because if you do a one-off, like Michael, I think, was one of the pioneers in this fish farming. If he would now build a second farm, he already knows the algorithm. He already knows how to automate it. So then the costs get lower. So how we scale and make standards out of that would drive costs down. And also to come to what Michael just said on the people, how can we then make it ease of use? Because if you standardize it, you can also optimize the ease of use. And I think that's also a very important topic.
I'm wondering if it's also a question of education for consumers as well. I recently went to an area in Spain, for example, and was horrified to see so much of the land covered by these sort of tented farming areas. And what hadn't occurred to me is that buying a tomato in Switzerland locally in winter perhaps isn't my smartest option, because that's what's encouraging maybe the sort of farming we don't want to see more of. How much does education play in terms of trying to reach out to consumers as well? Michael, is that a question for you, perhaps?
Well, absolutely. Glad to have a stab at that. Education is key in convincing a consumer that because it's locally grown doesn't mean that there's something inherently wrong with it. I mean, Singapore, again, is an interesting example. If you talk about food production in Singapore in one voice, generally people might scratch their heads. They might ask, well, is this the right place to grow food? I mean, it's a city. It's not a rolling countryside. The waters are urban waters. They're not waters of, let's say, a pristine fjord. And the answer to that is, of course, well, look at the bigger picture and understand that if we are producing far from the point of consumption, we don't know anything about the food, and we simply have to rely on what we're told. And secondly, we have the very heinous issues of carbon footprint, of wastage because of the packaging requirements, of spoilage because the food takes too long to get to the consumer. These are the issues that we need to be thinking about, and that needs a lot of convincing and education that local is fine and that local makes sense and that local is tasty.
Absolutely, Michael. I think production is just the first part of many parts to come down the value chain. And you mentioned the food wastage, the packaging. This all needs to be thought out. And whilst we mentioned earlier that we have to collaborate and coordinate on a local level, I think international efforts are also needed, and we can learn from one another. I'm actually attending a fascinating conference this week, which it's a shame you're not there, but you're more than welcome to join. It's in the Swiss Alps in Klosters, called the Klosters Forum, and it's all about food systems. So you can really see that on an international level, this is an issue that we're all trying to address. To what degree can we sort of look at the whole value chain from start to end and make it an international problem, Dilys? Or challenge, solution to solve?
Sure, and maybe I'll answer this in the context of the role that Enterprise Singapore plays, and for our international audience who may not be so familiar with Enterprise Singapore, we are a government and public sector agency that's driving industry development. And we do it in three broad areas, right? One is at the enterprise or the business level in driving transformation. And this is all around, adoption of high tech, embracing digital, and of course, building new worker capabilities. The second one is around internationalization. So really helping our companies broaden their global footprint. And the third one is around standards and accreditation, which is, as we noted, very important in the food and agriculture sector. And insofar as it pertains to international collaborations in all of these three areas, I think we are an agency that is a very strong proponent of international collaborations, particularly in the area of co-innovation, and an ability to kind of learn from each other and build deeper capabilities. So in the agri-tech, there are again so many examples. We have one of our local companies called Live Fresh, who's co-innovating with a UK-based farm, Liberty Farm, on container farm prototypes. And this really allows, the enterprises to share information around the conditions, the constraints in each market, and perhaps even access the markets at a much quicker pace. I mean, we see collaborations taking place between a private enterprise and academic institutions as well, and that remains a priority. Or even, large corporates enabling the local small, medium enterprises, and this remains very important because when we talk about, food sustainability, it's not just the privilege of the large corporates, but it's something that we feel that the small enterprises can participate in, but they just need kind of access to the right capability to build, whether it's food waste valorization or, more nutritive products. So I think these are where the key areas we think collaborations and international collaborations are critical.
Dilys, if I can just jump in there, that's a really interesting point. 3 years ago, we first started talking and collaborating with Siemens. And I remember when we first started, people were certainly scratching their heads thinking, what on earth can a fish farm be doing with Siemens? And how does digitization play a role in that? So fast forward 3 years later, and it turns out that it was prescient to think back then about digitization. We didn't exactly know why, but we did it anyway. And now, of course, it opened up the whole realm of data and sharing data, as you rightly say. The data from farms in Holland and Israel and Singapore, just as 3 examples of countries which are, let's say, strapped for land or strapped for resources, is very interesting to share because we face the same constraints. But the data that Siemens, from a factory automation perspective, can provide to a fish farm such as us is also invaluable because we never would have thought about our systems the way that we think of them now, which is to integrate them completely, to monitor externally, and then to predict rather than to react to situations. So I think that the whole future pivots on collaboration and forward-looking institutes.
Thank you. I think we spoke a lot about the importance of policymakers, lawmakers in conjunction with big corporations and the investment that's also needed globally. What about the private sector? How large a role does the private sector play in the future of food production? And Michael, maybe that's a good question for you.
Well, the private sector and the public sector, or at least from a policy perspective, need to work hand in hand. The private sector is, of course, very good at identifying needs from an economic perspective and to understand what works. But quite often there needs to be policy that helps as well. And I just want to come back to that question you raised earlier about GMO. If you ask people here in Singapore, what do you think about GMO? You'll get an answer that I think is reflected in other countries, which is to say, if I can avoid it, I will. But I'm not exactly sure where the GMO foods are. I mean, we happen to know that we talk about rice from Monsanto, which is GMO altered, but the consumer might not know that. So, for instance, if you think about how to invigorate a policy of buying local, it could be that through government checks and balances of those farms that do produce locally, they could then be certified, which is straightforward, as GMO-free. And then, of course, you have your angle to the market, because we're constantly having to explain to the market what's different to us compared to something that's imported and possibly also cheaper.
We did have a question actually from our audience. A question on, can we preempt the negative side effects of moving more and more to digital farming, smart farming, precision farming, automation? We know there's negatives of all situations. Can we start to preempt them now? Maybe that's a question for you, Rainer.
Yeah, absolutely. And no, yeah, for sure we can preempt them now, because I think we can see a lot of similarities, where we go into more technology, data-driven business. From a data privacy perspective, for example, I think we can learn out of other industry which are might a little bit farther ahead in the way of digitalization, and also look at that now when we go more and more into a more high-tech precision farming food production. And especially, for example, the topic of data privacy, I think is a very, very important one. So how can we make sure that in the aspects of, for example, doing a complete transparent supply chain from farm to consume, that, for example, data is private but can also not be manipulated. And those aspects are important. Technologies are there. It's not a question of, is it possible from a technology perspective? It's possible to do that. The question is there demand, for example, from the consumer in order to do so? And then we can apply already those technologies which do somehow preempt maybe some negative effects.
Thank you. Dilys, did you have anything to add there?
No, I think like Raina said, there is a lot we can learn across industry, and we have seen some of the partnerships being fostered already between agriculture firms and high-tech engineering firms to bring the right capability, whether it's automated farming or data-driven farming. But perhaps there perhaps needs to be the next wave of focus on issues like cybersecurity, data privacy, which Raina talked about. And again, this goes back to the capability that the organizations need to build. And I say this in the context of a small economy like Singapore, where each firm may not be able to build up capability in all areas. So are there mechanisms that we can tap some of these specialist skills virtually, perhaps, or how can we perhaps find ways to share the capability across some of the smaller firms?
That's a really interesting point, and we always talk about data mining. And of course, to do good data mining, you need to have a big data set. And that's the problem, really, of small firms operating in smaller countries like Singapore. They're not large enough to have a meaningful data set. So on the one hand, we worry about privacy, but there's also an opportunity, and that is to share the data. Because if you have shared data with bigger data sets, the trends or best practices, you could call them, might start to crystallize. And from that in turn has a direct benefit on the small operator who doesn't have access to that sort of data mining power. And I think really the future is data and how we best use that data. And I think some degree of collaboration and sharing will suit everybody well.
We had a question come in on the pandemic and what could we have done? How could we have been better prepared to ensure that products continued to come through onto the shelves? How could we have been better prepared for that? Dilys, would you like to take that?
The $1 million question, and perhaps hindsight is always 50-50. I guess for a country that's so dependent on imports of our food supply, it really emphasized the need to kind of diversify our food sources. And although we already import, maybe about 15 years ago from over 15 different countries, 140 countries, we now import our food from over 170 countries. So I think the need to continually look at diversifying our food sources is important. And of course, embedded behind that is really the international partnerships that we need to foster, but also unlocking, regulatory constraints around imports and conversely exports from those markets. I think it has also emphasize the need to kind of accelerate R&D perhaps in alternative foods. So in the area of alternative proteins, for example, how can we accelerate perhaps some of the regulatory approvals in these new food items? Perhaps is another area that we need to look at quite immediately.
I'm wondering if we can just spend a moment or two on food wastage, because of course where there's production, there's also waste, both in production and also at the consumer end. How are efforts being tackled to really reduce this wastage on an international level, perhaps, and local? Michael?
Well, it's the big question, because where you have waste, you don't have sustainability, because that's a process that normally can't go on indefinitely. So from a production point of view, of course, there are, and technology does allow you to deal with waste. Waste is, of course, fertilizer, for instance, if that can be collected, and that can be remediated, let's say. I'm not saying it's easy, but with the right incentives, we can think about food waste and production waste in the sense of, well, there's an opportunity somewhere. If, for instance, I'm processing food, rather than throwing away the parts that can't be sold, I need to be thinking about converting that to something else, the offcuts. In fish, for instance, the heads, the tail, the bones can be used as either fertilizer or they can be used to make other food products. There's no need to simply discard that. If we think about packaging, I mean, that's a tremendous source of waste. I mean, perhaps a slightly different topic, but again, producing closer to the markets also allows us to rethink our packaging options.
And how does data actually support and help reduce wastage?
Data, of course, is couples directly into, from a production perspective, it couples directly into utilization of those resources. Oxygen is a resource, water is a resource, fertilizer is a resource. Overusing fertilizers leads to waste, leads to runoff, leads to changes in the environment. So everything is interconnected and coupled. Data also allows us to better optimize our logistics and have just-in-time services rather than all the spoilage that we normally see.
And I'm wondering, as we're speaking, if the concept of having your own containers and going to the store and packing them into your own containers, is that a solution? Are we really seeing that taking place around the world? And is it successful? Dilys, are you seeing any of that in Singapore?
I think we're certainly encouraging the efforts. I think through this pandemic, with the various stages of the shutdowns of dining in, for example, there's a much increase in food delivery. Many cooking out of home, and hence the grocery shopping bills went up. So it was timely that we took the opportunity to encourage both the individual consumers as well as the businesses, to use reusable packaging, and also to inject new forms of packaging, beyond the single-use plastics into recyclable materials. But Amanda, if you allow me, I just wanted to add on a point around the sustainability agenda. And I alluded to it earlier, that really sustainable food systems are not a privilege of large corporates, but it is something that our small enterprises can play in, if only we are able to create the right access for smaller companies to be able to bring the right capability in-house. And again, we can do this through collaborations. So for example, one of our local soybean beverage manufacturers, Mr. Bean, Michael might know more of them. They partnered with one of the polytechnics, Republic Polytechnic, to develop a low-calorie, nutritious granola bar out of the okara, which is a byproduct of the soybean manufacturing. But on their own, they would not have been able to innovate, but really they need that external expertise, either from academic institutions or even corporates who may have that in-house R&D capability. So I think fostering those collaborations would be highly important.
Thank you, Dilys.
Yeah.
Michael, please chip in. We've got a few minutes left.
I just wanted to jump in there. Absolutely, that's a very interesting topic with okara and soybean. And of course, the other use for okara is as a protein replacement of fish feed. Okara right now has no real use. At least there are very few uses for it. So we can go via an intermediate like a fish to convert one form of protein into another, or we can go directly as in that example just then, where we combine that into a cookie or into an alternative protein shake or something else. We have to really start thinking out of the box.
You actually naturally answered one of the questions from the audience on how do you create highly nutritious and I guess tasty foods and match it with food security and technology in the future. So we actually answered that. I'll take one more question from the audience before we have to wrap up. And that's a question on how, when you're integrating, say, vertical farming into the urban setting, are there other benefits that we can think of to communities other than obviously the food production? Rainer, we haven't heard from you. Maybe you would like to answer that.
Well, I think this is a quite interesting jobs. I mean, we are generating now, because maybe manual work goes down, but having those kind of technologies and applying those technologies is generating additional jobs. And normally, when you get higher productivity, you get more wealth, and that is, I think, an important aspect, because you need to look for jobs for the people, which are kind of sustainable for the future. They need to learn more things, and this is also an aspect which is very important. But I think normally going in this direction will create more valuable jobs.
Maybe a word from Michael or Dilys. I'm wondering if you have the urban farm on your balcony, for example, are you as a homeowner or renter benefiting from that?
Well, interesting you asked that because in the last circuit breaker or lockdown in Singapore last year, I did set up my little home garden, and it's I must say it's flourishing. Considering I don't have green fingers, but absolutely, I think in the use of, rethinking the use of unused spaces, let's say the top of rooftops or car parks who are not, fully utilized, can we change that into community garden spaces, right? And we have seen some of these ground up initiatives happening, and the local community looks like they're quite excited about these opportunities. I think it also allows some of our F&B players maybe to extend into local gardening, so they have that farm to fork whole chain within their businesses. So those are exciting opportunities for the community as well.
Thank you very much. It's time to wrap up, but Michael, Rainer, Dilys, thank you so much for your contribution and a very interactive audience we had. And please stay with us, because next we have our pre-recorded panel on security in cities, so how to stay safe. Thank you for joining me.